Hello Tolkien geeks, and welcome back to Voice of Geekdom. This video is part of my playlist series on the Silmarillion. Please remember to push that like button and share your theories, questions and corrections with the community in the comments section below. If you're not already subscribed, push the big red button and please consider clicking the bell icon button to activate notifications. Last time on The Silmarillion Explained, we read about the flight of the Noldor, where Feanor led his people across the ocean in the hijacked fleet of swan ships from Alqualonde. Feanor left his brother Fingolfin behind when he sailed back into the east, forcing the younger brother to navigate the deadly Helcaraxe in order to cross the ocean. That was the frozen, grinding ice which connects the continent of Aman with the north of Beleriand. Today's chapter concerns the evolution of the section of early elvish society which was left behind in Beleriand after the last of the Teleri left for Valinor. That's the Sindar, who were the Teleri elves who stayed behind when Elwë, that's King Thingol's original name, remember, was lost in the forest of Nan Elmoth. To pick up this part of the story, I want to take us back to chapter 5 briefly, to a passage which we didn't cover in my previous video. When Elwë awoke from his long trance, he came forth from Nan Elmoth with Melian, and they dwelt thereafter in the woods in the midst of the land. Greatly though he had desired to see again the light of the trees, in the face of Melian he beheld the light of Aman as in an unclouded mirror, and in that light he was content. His people gathered about him in joy, and they were amazed, for fair and noble as he had been, now he appeared as it were a lord of the Maia, his hair as grey silver, tallest of all the children of Iluvatar, and a high doom was before him. Thingol was changed and empowered by the trance, and the light of Melian the Maia, and it would appear that his descendants were affected by it too. The line of Melian and Thingol, starting with their daughter Luthien, will continue to be of primary importance throughout the entirety of Tolkien's legendarium. Thingol is, as the text says, the tallest of all the children of Iluvatar. The line of Elros, from which the kings of Númenor are descended, and therefore also notably Elendil the Tall, are all descendants of Thingol's line, and they were known for their tall stature too, as was Aragorn millennia later, which we see emphasised over and over again in the physical descriptions of the character in The Lord of the Rings. In Middle-earth, in Beleriand, the elves that had remained behind now take Elwë as their king again. These elves were called the Sindar, the Grey Elves, and in their language, Elwë was called Elu Thingol, which is King Greymantle. Under his guidance, and that of Melian, the Sindar thrived to become the wisest and the most skillful of the elves of Middle-earth during the years of the trees. Sindarin, their language, remained the primary tongue of the entire continent even after the Noldor returned, whose language had shifted in the years of separation from their kin in Middle-earth. This takes us back to a theme which we picked up on in chapter 5, the theme of the divergence of language, and on Tolkien's development of his invented languages influencing the creation of the secondary world he imagined to place those languages within. During the second of the 3 ages of Morgoth's captivity in the halls of Mandos, another newly formed civilization arrived in Beleriand, and these were the dwarves, Aulë's children, who soon inhabited vast halls in the sides of the Ered Luin, the Blue Mountains in the east of our map here. Their capitals were the cities of Nogrod and Belagost. These dwarf holds were inhabited by the clans of the Broadbeams and the Firebeards. Remember that each of the 7 fathers of the dwarves, invented by Aule back in chapter 2, founded each of the 7 clans. Their people believed that the fathers of the dwarves, the most famous of whom was Durin, were re-embodied in their descendants. The dwarves were even hired by King Thingol of the Sindar to build his city in the realm of Doriath. Therefore the Naugrim laboured long and gladly for Thingol, and devised for him mansions after the fashion of their people, delved deep in the earth. Where the Esgalduin flowed down and parted Neldoreth from Region, there rose in the midst of the forest a rocky hill, and the river ran at its feet. There they made the gates of the Hall of Thingol, and they built a bridge of stone over the river, by which alone the gates could be entered. Beyond the gates, wide passages ran down to high halls and chambers far below that were hewn in the living stone, so many and so great that dwelling was named Menegroth, the 1,000 Caves. Collaboration between the dwarves and the elves was still commonplace in the Elder Days. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains built the Dwarf Road, which became a major trade route connecting Doriath to the Ered Luin. Thingol's early congenial trade relationship with the dwarves will set up the conflict with the Sindar later on, which will begin the long enmity between these two peoples, which was foreshadowed back in chapter 2. The elves even commissioned the dwarves to create weapons for them. The most famed and skillful dwarven smith in that time was Telkar of Nogrod. The Silmarillion doesn't mention this specifically, but Telkar was the same smith whom the Lord of the Rings tells us forged Narsil, the sword of Elendil, which was of course later reforged into Aragorn's sword, Anduril, as well as Angrist, the dagger which Beleriand would use to cut the Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. Another group which entered Beleriand at that time were the Nandor. These were the elves that were mentioned in chapter 3 during the description of the westward march of the elves as having turned aside as the Teleri host reached the river Anduin. Back then they were led by Lenwë, but they are led now by his son Denethor. That's no relation to the later steward of Gondor that we know from The Lord of the Rings. And he led them, at last, across the Blue Mountains, where they were welcomed by their cousins the Sindar, and settled there in the land of Osiriand, in the southeast. After Morgoth returned to Middle-earth and was assailed by Ungoliant, his ally, the giant spider fled into the south and came into the realm of King Thingol, and a terror of darkness was about her. But by the power of Melian she was stayed, and entered not into Neldoreth, but abode long time under the shadow of the precipices in which Dorthonion fell southward. And they became known as Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror, and none dared go thither or pass nigh them. There life and light were strangled, and there all waters were poisoned. The power of Melian was great indeed to hold back the monstrous Ungoliant, who was presumably still empowered by her devouring of the 2 trees, and yet also perhaps wounded after her battle with the Balrogs of Morgoth. After the installation of Morgoth to Angband in the north, and the construction of Thangorodrim, darkness and evil began to grow in Beleriand again, and orcs plagued the lands, eventually attempting to cut Doriath off from its allies, from Círdan in the west, and from Denethor in Osiriand. The orcs attack Círdan first, and were successful in driving the Falathrim back to their walled havens by the sea, besieging them and cutting them off from Thingol, who calls upon his new allies in the south. The Nandor, who were new to warfare on such a scale, were poorly equipped for battle in comparison with the wealthier Sindar with their dwarven crafted arms and armour. With the help of the dwarves of Nogrod and Belagost, the orcs were defeated only at great cost to the Nandor, including the loss of Denethor, their king, before Thingol's army arrived to relieve their allies. After this, they began to call themselves the Calaquendi, or Green Elves, and became a secretive people, never taking another king or fighting in open warfare again. After learning of the defeat of Círdan in the west, Thingol withdrew all his people that his summons could reach within the fastness of Neldoreth and Region, and Melian put forth her power and fenced all that dominion round about with an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment, the girdle of Melian, that none thereafter could pass against her will or the will of King Thingol, unless one should come with a power greater than that of Melian the Maia. And this inner land, which was long named Eglador, was after called Doriath, the guarded kingdom, land of the girdle. Within it there was yet a watchful peace, but without there was peril and great fear, and the servants of Morgoth roamed at will, save in the walled havens of the Falas. The concept of the girdle of Melian as an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment is a really interesting category of enchantment that we often see weaker versions of within the elven world in subsequent ages. Both the illusion that the elves of Mirkwood use in order to hide from Bilbo and the dwarves in The Hobbit, and the protection of Galadriel over Lothlorien recall the more powerful magic of the girdle of Melian from the First Age. Next time we will read the myth of the first rising of the sun and moon, which signals the beginning of the Age of Men.